Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9 of the Food Systems Seminar this winter 2021 quarter. I cannot believe this is the second to last seminar of our time together. I hope you're all hanging in there and doing well, taking time to appreciate the spring that is quickly unfolding, at least here in Seattle, and that feels full of potential. So for these final 2 weeks, we are going to have a chance to focus on production systems within the food supply chains. Today, we're going to focus on Washington farms and ranches and their experiences throughout the pandemic. And next week, we're going to focus more on the farm worker experience throughout COVID-19. So just positioning you here on our very familiar at this point FAO framework of food systems to see what we will be covering today in relation to our food systems perspective. And with that brief introduction, I am so happy to turn my attention to welcoming our speaker for the day to speak on findings from the Washington State Farm Resilience Survey, considering the impacts and adaptations during COVID-19. Anna Fogel and Sarah Collier are both the architects of this presentation, and today we have the opportunity to welcome Anna Fogel as our speaker. Anna is currently a graduate student in the School of Public Health in the Nutrition Program, the coordinated GCPD, Registered Dietetics and Nutrition Program. She has a BS in Nutrition from Bastyr and a culinary degree from the Art Institute of Seattle. Most of Anna's work experience has been within the food industry, and now she's working to transition her focus more onto nutrition and public health with a focus on community-based interventions as well as occupational and employee health. And with that, I'll just say welcome to you, Anna. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can start sharing yours, and I'll disappear into the background for your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Yuna. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that all right? Great. Hello, food supply chain students. My name is Anna Fogel, and like Dr. Sivo said, I am a graduate student in Nutritional Sciences Program, Master's in Public Health here at the University of Washington. I'll be presenting on the WA Farm COVID-19 survey that we've been developing over the past 7 months. We're going to be talking about its development and our preliminary results. So this project is a full partnership between the University of Washington, Washington State University, and the Washington State Department of Agriculture. As you can see, our study team on the right bottom corner, there's a couple of familiar names. We have Dr. Sipos, who is obviously your instructor here. And part of our team is also Laura Raymond from the Washington State Department of Agriculture, who presented in your class last week, I think. This presentation was developed between myself and Dr. Sarah Collier, who is my thesis advisor and also the PI on this project. Her input has been vital and greatly impacted the information that has been generated here. And I also want to acknowledge all the farmers who participated in this survey anonymously and give them thanks, and also thanks to the individuals and organizations that have helped to provide feedback and disseminate information within this survey. So just a bit of an overview of what we'll be covering today. We are going to go over the development and deployment of this survey. So this includes what the purpose of this survey is and gives a little background into how we developed this final product. We're going to put special emphasis on the amazing stakeholder input we were able to receive from our multiple community partners. And then I'll cover the structure of the survey itself and how it was deployed to the agricultural community in Washington State. We'll then pivot over to our preliminary findings, which we're still in the process of ciphering through. These include general respondent characteristics, COVID-19 impacts and experiences, and hopes and apprehensions as we embark on the 2021 growing season. So with that, we will jump into our survey development and deployment. So what is the purpose of this survey? Well, the primary purpose is to identify how the shock of COVID-19 pandemic has impacted farms and ranches located in Washington state, developed through the scope of farm and food system resilience. So this includes strategies and situations that contributed to resilience within this specific sect of the food system. We developed a very detailed survey in order to gather relevant and nuanced information about farm operator and owner experiences during 2020 in order to both inform recovery efforts and develop a baseline framework to quantify resilience. This information has the potential to enhance points of resilience in our food system to future challenges and becomes particularly important as time progresses and this shock of COVID-19 becomes more of a stressor on our overall food system. It also allows us to identify where in the system there is the most need for change. So in order to create a survey around resilience, we have to define it. And so resilience is a very broad and conceptual term. And we needed to identify exactly what resilience meant in the context of this survey. And I think that the definition by Mewison et al. Frames this concept very clearly. They defined it as the ability to ensure provision of system functions in the face of increasingly and complex accumulating economic, social, environmental, and institutional shocks and stresses through the capacities of robustness, adaptability, and transformability. So what is really wonderful about this survey are those capacities through which resilience in the system can be identified. So we've adapted these capacities to fit the need of this particular survey. Robustness is identified as a farmer's initial capacity to withstand a disturbance based on ex ante or pre-existing systemic components. So essentially, what already existed to help or inhibit business function. Adaptability is defined as the capacity and resourcefulness of farms to change inputs, production, and marketing and risk management in response to the shock of COVID-19 and continue business functionality. So, how did business pivots after this systemic shock? And finally, transformability is the capacity of farms to significantly change the internal structure and feedback mechanisms of the farm system in response to the shock of COVID-19, which made business as usual impossible. So basically, what systemic changes were necessary? So the image on the right is adapted from a study by Tyndall et al. And I think it's a really great contextual model to visualize this concept. You can see on the y-axis that we have farm functioning, and on the x-axis we have time. After a disturbance, in this case, COVID-19 pandemic, we can identify what was in place to absorb the effects of the shock to continue business functioning. And so adaptability is that ability to rapidly react to this event. So I want to identify that transformability is not on this particular image, but it would be lumped in with adaptability as methods that were necessary to increase farm resilience. So who exactly are we surveying? Well, our target population was farm and ranch owners and or operators over the age of 18 years with a business located in Washington state. They could be of all sizes and any production output. We wanted to generate generalizable information, so we needed farms of all scales and production models located in counties throughout Washington state to be represented. Particular focus in the past has been placed on small to mid-sized farms, but we really wanted to inform resilience in a big picture way to tell the story of all producers throughout the state. So to develop questions for this particular survey, nationally deployed surveys were categorized. These were any surveys geared toward the agricultural community that were deployed between March, so when the pandemic started, and August of last year. These tended to be primarily rapid response surveys indicating what kind of immediate support producers required in the short term. 18 surveys were analyzed with a particular focus on the Washington State Department of Agricultural's Economic Impact Survey that was deployed in May of last year. We really wanted to identify which questions were most relevant to our specific survey and how we could bridge this information with the data that was gathered by WSDA. So this project is truly a partnership between UW, WSDA, and WSU. And I think that the old adage, it takes a village, really comes into play with any project of this scale. So all of us met weekly between August of last year and December of last year to identify what pre-existing data was telling us and where there were gaps that existed within this data. Since there were really no data sources at this point, we would need to kind of bridge that gap between theory and practice. It can be easy in academia to get bogged down by theory, which only really generates part of a story and doesn't really show exactly what's occurring in the real world. So to get a better understanding of what Washington farmers were experiencing and efficiently communicate their narrative, we needed to gather input from stakeholders within the agricultural industry. So meetings were conducted between September 21st to October 8th with 17 industry stakeholders that represented private businesses, non-governmental organizations, and commodity commissions, representing and interacting with a large and varied agricultural population. The primary focus was on trends that these stakeholders observed within their corresponding agricultural sectors. We really wanted to gain a better understanding of what decisions were being made and why these decisions were being enacted by farmers. So the information that we were able to gather was so much more robust than anyone on the team had imagined. Because of the amount of information that we collected, we were able to generate a memorandum to the Washington State Department of Agriculture, which you can see there on the right, so that key trends can be communicated to Washington farmers in a timely manner. There were 8 primary themes that emerged from these interviews and were indicated by at least 5 interviewees each individually. We had shifting market channels from wholesale to direct-to-consumer markets meant increasing focus on regional distribution and significant pivots in business practices and production models. Business pivots to online and direct-to-consumer markets were resulting in the establishment of what we dubbed the new middleman, resulting in a reduced need for third-party distributors. Increased networking and communication between farms has enhanced collaboration and supported local food systems. Government support is vital for business functionality and must be accessible to farms of all sizes. Increased consumer education is necessary to sustain this trend of local and regional purchasing. Because of uncertainty around labor practices, there has been an increase in automation and technological advancement by producers. And lack of infrastructure is a primary barrier that inhibited farmers from adapting or expanding their practices. So this includes issues such as limited storage capacity. And then finally, and quite frankly, not surprisingly, uncertainty about the next growing season is a leading concern for Washington state producers. So with all of this information and input, the final survey format was temporally based. So it was based off of time. It had a total of 82 questions utilizing a mixed methods approach. So we had binary, yes, no, Likert scale, and qualitative or short answer questions. We utilized these multiple question types in order to gather a good balance of both quantitative and qualitative data. Because as we study resilience, we need both numbers and experiences to get a detailed story of what's actually occurring. The survey consisted of 9 sections that included respondent characteristics, pre-COVID attributes, so 2019 information, attributes during 2020, comparison of attributes from 2019 and 2020, farmers' COVID-19 operation experiences, COVID-19 resources, future perspectives, stress and mental health, and demographic information. So here on the left or on the right, we have a picture of our intro page. It gave a little, or could be considered a lot, of information about our survey and what type of information we were hoping to gather. So how was the survey deployed? Well, our survey was distributed online via RedCap software with both computer and smartphone capability. It was available in both English and Spanish and was online between December and January of this year. So standard outreach language was developed for distribution, and 82 partners and stakeholder affiliates were utilized to distribute the survey to their respective networks. So here are a few of the networks we used to distribute the survey throughout the state. As you can see, it's a collection of a bunch of different people that represent varying populations within the agricultural industry. So we have the Black Farmers Collective, Viva Farms, the Washington Potato Commission, and Tilth Alliance, just to name a few. So now that we've got a little background story about how the survey was developed, I'll be discussing some of our preliminary results. So the first thing we're going to jump into is general survey and farm characteristics. So as I mentioned previously, the survey was available from December 1st of last year to January 31st of this year. We had planned on only making it available during the month of December, but as COVID has taught all of us, adaptations and pivots are necessary. So we extended it into January just because we had a lower response rate, which could have been due to multiple different issues, such as it being the holidays, post busy growing season. So we did extend it for one extra month. We ended up receiving 265 completed survey responses. That doesn't include our incomplete responses, which brings our total up to almost 500 surveys that were filled out. And these 265 completed responses represented 33 counties in Washington state. Our highest response rate was from King County with about 41 responses, but overall we had a nice spread within our pool of respondents. So this bar graph identifies our responses based on production output. The largest product response was from those specifically working within vegetables, fruit, meat, and egg producers. And as you can see, we really put all of these different specific outputs that make up the bulk of Washington State's agricultural products, even specifying potatoes, onions, and tree fruit, which are all really high up there in what Washington State produces. So interestingly enough, over 75% of the farms we surveyed produced more than one type of product. So this indicates the importance of diversity within production models for many Washington state farmers. So our respondent pool consisted of primarily small farms in both acreage and gross annual revenue. About 45% of respondents owned or operated farms that were about 1 to 9 acres. But the remaining 55% of respondents had a pretty good spread in acreage across all categories. As you can see there, our next largest category was 10 to 49 acres, and that was at 23% of respondents. 70% of our respondents had a 2019 gross annual revenue that was under $250,000 a year. So there's kind of this back and forth with what constitutes a small to mid-sized farm. Technically, the definition is one grossing under $350,000 a year, but I think that tends to exclude a huge population of the farming industry. So as per WSDA's current definition, and for the sake of this survey, we define small to mid-sized farms as any grossing under $250,000 a year. So you can see there a huge, 75% of our respondents were small to mid-sized farms. So there was a pretty good mix of experience within our respondent pool. with 40% of our respondents operating a farm business for over 20 years. It then jumps down to about 21% of respondents in operation for 2 to 5 years. I want to note that this does not mean that a specific farm was in operation for 20 years, but rather that this amount of time is the amount of time that the respondent has worked within the agricultural industry. So that experience could have been spread over multiple farms. So as we think back to the fact that 40% of our respondents owned or operated small to mid-sized farms, this information really identifies that small farms don't necessarily indicate beginning farms. And I think this is really important to keep in mind when we understand how experience may affect business outcomes. So we have a little bit of an idea of who the respondents are, and we're now going to jump into some of the COVID-19 impacts and experiences that they've had. So these results are from a Likert scale question in which respondents were to identify how COVID has impacted their business on a scale from very positively to very negatively. You can see here with our first image that 60% of our overall respondents indicated that the pandemic has negatively impacted their business, while 30% have been positively impacted. Not groundbreaking information, but the numbers are there. And this is for all of our respondent pools. So this next image, we stratified responses based off of market channel distribution. So essentially, how far were the respondents distributing their product? We kind of lumped categories in together. So we had local and regional, which we defined as the amount of over 75% of their products being distributed within the county they operated, Washington State, Oregon State, or Idaho. And then similarly for national and international, it was 75% of their market channel distribution was either national or international. So we can see when we stratify these results that 54% of local and regional farmers were negatively impacted by COVID, while 38% identified as being positively impacted by COVID. And that's a little bit of an increase from when we look at our overall respondent pool. As we bring up this next image, there is a stark difference between producers who distributed in national and international markets, where you see an 82% indicating a negative impact on their business due to COVID and only 9% indicating a positive impact. So we can see here that once we start to kind of dig into who we're looking at and how their individual businesses were impacted, these numbers can change pretty drastically. So sales trends have been of particular interest for the agricultural sector. And this slide gives quantitative information for trends that have already been established by both stakeholders and producers. So we're essentially putting data to something that we already know is occurring. The striped bars indicate sales channels that were continued through from 2019 into 2020. The solid green bars indicate those that were started in 2020 and then, but not in operation during 2019. And then the blue bars are any channels that producers stopped selling their products through in 2020. Not surprisingly, the channels that were most frequently stopped were farmers markets and direct to restaurant, which makes sense considering stay-at-home orders, social distancing policy and practices that have been put into place. And the channels that were started most frequently were direct to consumer and food hubs. So these groups include food banks. And a big take-home theme from this information is that about 30% of farms started one new sales channel in 2020 when compared to 2019. So this is in trend with diversity being necessary for these businesses to continue to function, whether that diversity be what they are producing or how that product is being distributed. So here we can see trends in sales channels in 2020 when compared to 2019. There was a 7.6% decrease in direct-to-restaurant channels, a 15.2% decrease in farmers market sales, and a 26.3% decrease in direct-to-international markets. Not really surprising considering everything that was going on. A question that arises is, how did attributable revenue for farms that sold through those specific channels that were really impacted change in 2020 when compared to 2019? Do we know that yet? Nope, still got to look through the data, but hopefully it'll bring some issues to light as we continue to dig through the information we've gathered. So on top of these numbers, we have all of this very robust qualitative data in which we asked short answer questions, and respondents were very honest and open with a lot of the responses they gave. So here are a couple of quotes that really indicate the opposite ends of the experience spectrum, which just goes to show how unique 2020 was for individual producers. So we have one farm that stopped selling at farmers markets altogether, and then we have another farm who quadrupled and tripled sales to CSAs and local farmers markets. So I think this really illuminates the fact that identifying points of resilience in a dynamic, multifaceted, and complex system is tricky. But what's important is to really hone in on what has helped or inhibited these producers to develop support that can really help them continue to function. So one trend that was identified by our stakeholder interviews was the importance of networking and new collaborations in sustaining business practices. The question we asked was, have you established new working relationships as a result of COVID-19 and related disruptions? These numbers identify completely new relationships that were formed in 2020, with 18% of respondents generating new working relationships with other farms, another 18% with other collaborative networks, such as co-ops and food hubs, and then 11% establishing new collaborations with other agribusiness. So anybody that was involved in the agricultural industry in some way. And here are a few quotes from those qualitative questions that are directly from respondents and describe these newly established relationships. So one respondent worked with a group of local farmers to create a cooperative food hub. Another joined another farmer running an online marketplace, so working together towards the same goal. And in a rare positive Zoom quote, which we all know is very hard to find, Zooming at night brought folks together, not just to talk shop, but to talk and generate sharing ideas. And I think this hones in on how important it is to have a diverse array of experience and diversity in general as these producers begin to collaborate and try to find new ideas to move their businesses forward during this time. So, of course, we got to move on, and we will be looking into the future to kind of see some of the responses that we were able to obtain for the 2021 growing season. So there were many concerns that were identified by respondents. At the top was the capacity of processors to keep up with uncertain market trends. This is a particular concern for meat producers, where the pandemic has identified many issues amongst both small, individual, and USDA certified processors. As we've all seen through the news, many COVID hotspots have popped up within meat processing plants, which in my mind really indicate a need to change how these processing lines are operated, and maybe give a little bit of leeway to these smaller meat processors. Not surprisingly, another concern of note was how producers would be able to respond to unforeseen expenses and uncertainty in the market. It's hard to predict consumer practices. You know, we didn't know that consumers would be purchasing locally even though it makes sense if you think about everything that's occurring. So it's kind of like, how do we address these consumer practices as things become more normal within the system? And then finally, supply chain disruptions, particularly to inputs, was identified as an emerging concern as market trends changed throughout the next year. So since there is so much uncertainty for producers in the next year, we really wanted to end the survey on a more hopeful note to identify how confident farmers are in their ability to adapt to the COVID-19 related challenges based on specific attributes such as financial capacity and personal network and human capacity. So you can see on the left side that 25% of farms were not confident in their financial capacity to meet a challenge, which is a sizable amount. But 54% were somewhat confident in their financial capacity to meet any challenges that may arise this year. To me, this indicates that there needs to be continued government support for farms of, and I'm going to emphasize this again, all scales and sizes. We can't just focus on what Washington State's largest agricultural outputs are, but how these smaller, more dynamic farms bring their own color and robustness to this system. But overall, there is a lot of optimism, such as, one farmer indicating that they had to spend a lot of time increasing and expanding their online presence, but they're hoping that this will go into next year and one less thing that they'll have to develop from scratch, essentially. So we can also see that 57% of farms are somewhat confident in their ability to continue functionality this year based on their personal network and human capacity. We also included questions about stress and mental health, which is really important to address when we're discussing any sort of community resilience. So these questions were gauged through a standardized PHQ-4 question type that's applicable to a larger population. And about over 40% of our respondents reported feeling stressed all or most of the time. So while there is a lot of stress, especially about what's going on over the next year, there's still a lot of optimism within this industry. And reiterating that point that the diversity of experience will help to not only allow businesses to continue to function, but also contribute to transformations within a system that can desperately benefit from these changes. So as I mentioned, there will be more data emerging as we continue to dig into the information we've collected. My thesis project has a particular focus on farmer resilience and farm system resilience, but due to the overall nature of the information and its partnerships that we used to develop it, there will be a few public briefs that will be made available over the next few weeks. So here I have also included the project email and our website. Feel free to reach out to Dr. Collier or myself with any questions that come up. And that is the end.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. I'm clapping on behalf of the hundreds of students who will be watching this video and wishing we were all together. That was so much information that you managed to just share with us. And I really appreciate, I just want to point out a couple things I appreciate. One is that you mentioned other people on the team, and of course, Laura Raymond being a presenter. And I have been so excited to be part of this process as well. And you also mentioned the Washington Potato Commission, who is also part of our seminar speaker series here, and the Black Farmers Collective, who have been seminar speakers previously. And so we really start to see this kind of Washington-wide network of actors and leaders in food systems, and particularly in food production, farm and food production. I was so struck by the findings around diversity. And that's something that I think has just been really illuminating for those of us on the project, and that I think will, has the potential to really inform practice over time as well. And so the diversity that I heard you talk about was on-farm diversity, so growing more than one product for market, and also diversity of market channels. Is that right? So I wonder if you have, in addition to the briefs that will be sent to WSDA, and as you think about your own master's research, what are some other highlights that you think will help to affect policies that ultimately might change practices on farms? I know that's a big question, but just thinking about where this research will land, both in Washington State and also more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I mean, as we've seen and has been indicated recently with some news articles and other information that has arisen, small to mid-sized farms have been able to rise to the challenge, but that doesn't negate the challenges that they're going through. And so we tend to hyper-focus on funding commodity crops just because of the way that our food system is structured. But I think in my mind, especially once we start digging into the qualitative data, we're going to see that while the numbers could potentially reflect these small to mid-sized farms being able to continue to function, it doesn't indicate that they'll be able to survive. And so we need to really look into this information and see how we can interpret it to help farms of all sizes. And that's why I kept emphasizing all sizes, because their experiences matter for something. And, you can have an economist regurgitate numbers to you and projections all day, but until you read the experiences that these farmers have gone through, you're not going to truly understand how much they're struggling and how difficult it's actually been for their businesses. So.
Thank you. That's such a thoughtful comment, and also I know informed the survey design, that had, both the collection of the kind of hard numbers of what the impacts were on the businesses, but also left room for farmers and ranchers to really comment and share insights into some of the struggles, the challenges, and also the successes. I think that's all the time that we have for today, but I just want to also appreciate that you ended with some optimism, thinking about, that there is this potential to kind of galvanize on the positive learnings from the past year and really work to support these farmers and ranchers as we go into the next set of unknowns for the next growing season here and beyond. So I really want to thank you, and thank you also to Dr. Collier, of course. And I really look forward to continuing to be involved and continuing to see the great work that you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you.